My name is Inge Patsch and welcome to the series Blind Spots of Economic Theories. Today, Neoliberalism Part 2. If you haven't watched Part 1 and you're not exactly sure what neoliberalism is, I highly recommend you checking out my first video so that you understand the context of what I'm talking about. This series is actually based on the book Embracing Complexity by Boulten, Allen and Cliff Bowman, which have also one chapter in their book about complexity view on economics, and they particularly highlight where neoliberalistic thinking has a lot of shortcomings when it comes from the perspective of a complexity worldview. And that's basically what I want to highlight here. I've made another video about the chances or how would complexity science see economics, but that's a different topic. So let's get started. They basically name 6 things which they consider being wrong with neoclassical thinking, such as there is no equilibrium, the future is path dependent, women or men are complex beings, economic aspects cannot be separated from social, political, and environment aspects. Then this dynamics between development and growth, as well as the idea that we cannot ignore limits to growth. So let's have a look at all 6 of them. The first one, there is no equilibrium. They basically, in this, you have known from my series probably in systemic thinking, there is something like called reinforcing loops or balancing loops, and they would say that there is reinforcing and balancing loops. We can find them all over in economics, and as you know, there is a behavior over time, and reinforcing and balancing loops normally have all kinds of behavior, but not anything like a straight line which is increasing or decreasing as the supply and demand curve would make us think. So it's a very dynamic pattern where just it's much more complex than simply 2 lines meeting at a certain point. Also, Joseph Stiglitz, former chief economist of the World Bank, can be understood in a way as Beckhaus, for example, was publishing in this one journal. He would say, Stiglitz's theoretical work tells him that markets cannot be characterized by the equilibrium of competitive supply and demand, and hence that policy responses may have effects that are very different from those that they commonly believed to have. So we see that even high-ranking economists have figured out that economy is simply much more complex and cannot be reduced to this supply and demand function. Second, there is a path dependence and a lock-in. So when we would talk about a free market or this idea that the economy is like regulating itself through supply and demand, it doesn't consider, and if you have watched my series about complexity thinking, you know this loop. This is like the adaptive loop. And we know from complexity science and from the adaptive loop that throughout going into this loop, when there is growth, stability, and conservation, normally the players in any system, they would minimize, the relationships would minimize, there are less and less relationships, so it's getting more and more rigid, it's getting, that's what is also conservation, more and more power, more and more energy, more and more matter would be accumulated in a certain point, and this can eventually lead to a lock-in. So this is what we know in economics very clearly from monopolies, for example. Just think, for example, about Microsoft, which has more or less the absolute monopoly, and it's really, really hard to come up. There is like no free competition anymore of softwares in many regards. No, it's simply there, like the market dominating things, and hence this idea of that the market balances and there would be more providers of goods and so on simply doesn't work, also because of that, because there is this tendency in any system that a few players eventually end up being very dominant, but then also make the system fragile, as we have learned in another video. Thirdly, women and men are complex beings, and I have talked about this already a lot in my first series. I just think I want to add 3 aspects on this, which complexity theory shines on this. Of course, and I mean something very obvious, but still I want to speak it out, is individuals influence each other, no? So you talk about something, we call this word of mouth in marketing, no? So they influence each other, they like build up each other. This is also called a bubble, no? Everyone believes that investing in real estate in Pinsko is so super efficient, so they would just all do it. So this is another dynamics which is not taking into consideration from the neoliberal theory of supply and demand. Also, that's something which Boulten et al. Claim in their book, and I actually agree with this, is saying information is not available enough. So you don't have sufficient information available. The world is too complex, you know too little. Like, just think about how much do you know about the food items you actually buy in your supermarket? Like, what do you know is in there? Like, yes, in theory it's written there, but do you know whether at any time in the supply chain there was a certain chemical used, or how many people were actually involved in producing it, and how are they doing, like how they treat it and so on. So we don't have all the information to make like really decisions. And even if we would have all the information, Simon Herbert is furthermore claiming that we wouldn't have the processing power to even process all this information. So this has already been shown by Simon Herbert in 1955, saying we don't have neither the information available, nor do we have the processing power to be the rational man, which neoliberalism is assuming we are. Next one, you cannot separate economics from the social and politics and the environment. So I think this expresses, if you have watched my series on complexity thinking and systemic thinking, it might become already clear what is meant with this. This is expressing the thing that the social, the political, and the economical are intrinsically interwoven, and many other theorists have also shown this. No, like Marx has shown how economics and social are strongly connected, and then Keynes has talked a lot about how politics and economics are connected. So while there might be some flaws in Keynes' assumption, but he saw how the political, different political means are able to really shape economics, be it the fiscal policy, be it the monetary policy, that there is a lot of shaping possible. So there is a lot of dynamics at play here, so that we cannot say this. Furthermore, there is this tendency in the society we live in now that we just put a price tag on everything. So we say, okay, maybe some economists have understood it, so they try to economize things inside. So they try to bring everything in this realm, but this is also which is simply not possible. No. Rebecca Costa has, in this context, written about the economization of everything. Also very interesting book to read. It's called The Watchman's Rattle. So anyhow, so we try to put the price tag on it, but what is the value of one tree or a forest or a clean water? So you cannot really say that. So I think this is coming again from this neoliberal point of view that only economics exists and nothing else can be existing and is reality, while actually there are simply things which we cannot measure in economic terms. Yes, second last one, the idea of growth and development. And I think that's a very interesting aspect where complexity thinking really shines some new lights on it. And if you have watched my other works and my other videos, you already know that economics and growth, or growth and development, are normally inextricably linked with each other, and growth always comes along with a material growth. So Peter Schumpeter was the first one to understand that there is a difference actually between growth and development, and he would talk about this idea of creative destruction, how sometimes entrepreneurs, innovators would bring in new technology, something new would emerge and totally change the way how a regime looks like. If you've watched my series on complexity thinking, you know how we have different regimes and there can be a tipping point, and how when we go to a tipping point, there are total new patterns. And I think that's also the difference between growth. So growth normally happens within the existing regime. So you have the same variables, you have the same patterns, the same relationships, only the quantity increases kind. So that's growth. That's what we run after when we want to grow the GDP also, for example. While development really talks about new variables, new patterns emerging, which can like emerge within the system, and then with Schumpeter simply press out old things. Just think about how digital photography has, for example, really made disappear Polaroid photography. Or think how online newspapers have really reduced the market and the relevance of printed newspapers. But then there can also be really saying, okay, in the tipping point, a total new thing, it can be a change into a new regime, so to say, a world where there are very new variables at play. Think about, for example, if we would one day really have a cradle-to-cradle society, how this would really change the way we shape relationships, no? Boulten and all further say that it's very tricky from a complexity point of view to distinguish empirically between fluctuations in existing patterns and the start of something new, also because change happens episodic. So I am the optimist here, and if I look out there and look at all the examples of community-supported agriculture and so on, I, for myself, would not say that's not just simply a change in pattern, but this is already an emerging sign that something new is coming up. But again, empirically, this cannot be proven. This is a viewpoint, so to say, but one which personally gives me a lot of hope. Yeah, last but not least, we cannot ignore the limits to growth. So if you are familiar with some of my other works, I'm sure you're familiar with the report to the Club of Rome by the Stockholm Resilience Center called Transformation is Feasible, which has shown how in order to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals within the planetary boundaries, we need to acknowledge a few things, among others, how we distribute wealth and so on. So how we can actually achieve these goals and acknowledge in the same time we cannot limitlessly grow in regard of our resources which we use. But also this means that we should become aware of inbuilt dynamics, mechanisms, such as, for example, the interest rate, which is causing a force to grow, which is causing in turn again an increase in material. So we have to acknowledge this, and whichever economic theory is supposed to happen needs to take things like this also into consideration. I hope you have enjoyed this extra part of what are the blind spots of neoliberalism from a complexity perspective, and thanks for watching.